Well, let's go back to the leadership question. If we look at China's new crop of leaders, it's very interesting because it's so different from just 2 decades ago. In some ways, China doesn't select its leaders by elections the way we do. But in some ways, it resembles a big corporation, the way they select their leaders. They are tested at the provincial level, usually as vice governors, governors, and now the road to the top is as a provincial party secretary, and it's from those positions that you vault into the top leadership. So that you have top leaders in China who have gone through a demanding testing process before they end up in the top positions. And we now have, of the 25 top members of China's leadership, the Politburo, they have an average age of 62, whereas in 1982, the average age of the Politburo was 72. So here we have China with a leadership that's in its lower 60s, and the United States that has one of our presidential candidates already 2 years past the mandatory retirement age for Chinese leaders. It's an interesting situation. Another comparison, 23 of the 25 Chinese leaders have university degrees, and some have advanced university degrees. In 1982, 0. None of the top leaders had a university degree. So what we see is that the Chinese leadership is changing and adapting as the country goes through this remarkable process of economic transformation. But in the United States, we're using the same old, tried and true process. The question is, can the United States deal effectively with a China which is using a selection process for its leaders that puts them an emphasis on ability and experience, whereas we rely on our electoral system? Are we going to be able to be competitive with the Chinese down the road? Or are we going to have to address somehow the question of getting more competence? There's a lot of competence in our government, but do we need more competence at the top level of our government?
It's hard to argue against competence, but but it's interesting listening to you. It almost sounded like you were making an anti-democratic argument that somehow they select their leaders and their leaders are more highly educated, experienced. But we are, as the famous saying goes, we have this system, and what's better. It may not be the best, but what's better. And the problem for me is that at the moment, and this comes back to what Geoffrey was saying, I think there is some pandering going on. There is real distress in the Rust Belt, so-called, and no one should disparage the cost of the loss of these industrial jobs. But I think it goes even beyond what the American people want when you see the politicians playing to an important constituency, which is the unions.
Right.
And the unions have real power. And the power, I must say, is both in terms of the old line unions and the unions that are growing with the increasing number of immigrants in the country, the service unions, SEIU and the like. And the power that those unions have at this moment in this midst of the American electoral process is without a doubt substantial. And I think it is driving much of this conversation. And it's not driving it on the level in which you are describing international trade or global, the whole global experience, opening the global markets. And I think that's why the elites were less likely to be union members, more likely to benefit from the kind of international trade, that larger canvas that you were speaking about. But how can you speak to somebody in a small town? And I think Obama got in trouble on this point.
He sure did.
But how can you speak to that person with some understanding? They have a legitimate right to their position, and they have legitimate concerns. Americans are changing jobs at a higher rate, and they feel some anger at the idea not just of the Chinese political positions, which I think are not understood in this country with the emergence of a Chinese, or the attempt to grow a Chinese middle class, but I think that they fear somehow that, that China has too much influence and that China is influencing our elites, our politicians, to the point that they're not representing the interests of the American people. That's a much more difficult argument.
Mm-hmm. I agree with Juan 100%. I agree with Juan 100%, but let me add one fact that I know is a fact that people in the Bush administration are concerned about, because when I uttered it in the presence of Susan Schwab, the USTR, she almost jumped on me. And the fact was a survey that the Wall Street Journal, of all places, did on American attitudes to trade, I think in December 2007, where the headline result was 6 in 10 Americans agree with the proposition that free trade has been bad for the United States. And to my mind, that's a remarkable statistic. So that doesn't sound to me like capture by the unions of a political process. What it says to me is that what we've observed in the US in the past 15 years, in the long boom after 1991, was an increasing, in the economics jargon, an increasing return to skill. The people at the top have done extraordinarily well. We've all done extraordinarily well, but as you know, real incomes for most Americans, including now Americans with college degrees, are flat. And so if you're a politician, you have to, they want you to do something about that. And what can you do about it? You can't blame what economists believe is the real cause, which is called information technology and increasing productivity to creativity and brain work, right? As opposed to driving a forklift or something. You know, once you get to a certain level of skill, you can lift 10 tons. In the age of IT, you know, we are really rewarded for our creativity and our true productivity, but that just increases gaps. So you're sitting there as a politician and you know that's the reality. What do? You listen to the public, and it seems to me that there are the public blames two groups for this, two things. One is globalization, but globalization's amorphous, so you start looking at places. You know, the idea that we're blaming Colombia for economic problems in the United States is quite fanciful, but we have to listen to it. But the other thing, of course, is undocumented migrants. They must be the cause of this as well. So that's where I think the leadership point does come back. So I'm not sure that I wouldn't, you know, somebody like Hank Paulson is going to score extraordinarily high on any competence indicator we have, but I would give him and the administration a lower grade on a communication dimension. Which is, you know, that biting the bullet and saying, look, those manufacturing jobs aren't coming back, but that there is a new source of employment for regular Americans that is going to increase as a result of the rise of China, not decrease. Now, can I just say one more thing on that, thinking about issues that are out there on the horizon? One might think that the emergence of 500 million consuming middle-class Chinese is the greatest thing that could ever happen to the US economy, because it would mean that American exports to China must boom. My sense is that that's not what's going to happen, and we see it already. What's going to happen is that American multinational firms who are salivating over that Chinese, this miraculous emergence of a Chinese consuming class, understand that to sell in China, they've got to be in China. And my favorite example there is the Walmart example. So 2 or 3 years ago, if we were having a conversation about Walmart in China, it would have all been about the fact that Walmart sourced 20-some billion dollars of goods in China to sell in the US, and boy, that's bad for American bike manufacturers. Today, the story in Walmart is that Walmart doesn't think they've got any growth opportunities in the US. They think they have growth opportunities in places like China. So what do? They allow unionized workforce. They even allow, I believe, the Chinese Communist Party cadres to meet on the shop floor. Why did they do that? They wanted the Chinese government to allow them to acquire another retailer so they could be the biggest retailer in China, right? That's a globalization story. That's going to be a new globalization story. And explaining why that is good to the US is going to be even tougher, because the rise of a Chinese consuming class isn't necessarily going to solve the trade deficit problem. Because in the global economy, you slice up the value chain. You do stuff where it makes most sense. It's not traditional David Ricardo trade anymore. And I don't think that the political debate has taken that on at all, and at some point it will have to.